Boom, and just like that, it is week 6 of the fantasy season, so you know exactly what we need to do. We're going to go through every single matchup, talk about every single wide receiver, and go over who you should be starting and who you should be sitting here in week 6 of the fantasy season. All right, very quickly here, we have 2 teams on bye week here in week 6, the Houston Texans, so no Nico Collins, no Christian Kirk or anybody else left, no Minnesota Vikings, so no Justin Jefferson, no Jordan Addison. Make sure you guys are checking your rosters and adjusting accordingly. All right, Thursday Night Football, let's start with the Eagles traveling to face the Giants. A.J. Brown, another disappointing fantasy day in week 5 with 9.3 fantasy points against the Denver Broncos. 8 targets, 5 catches, 43 receiving yards. But quite frankly, I wasn't expecting a ton out of A.J. Brown in week 5, not really based on how the season has gone so far, but based on the fact that he was facing the Denver Broncos as the wide receiver 1, and with Pat Surtain as the primary number 1 cornerback on that team, I don't generally recommend starting wide receiver 1s against the Denver Broncos. So we had him as a flex last week, and I still have him as a flex on a short week here against the Giants, but you should feel better. This is a really good matchup. The Giants have been a bottom 5 unit against opposing wide receivers in terms of fantasy points allowed. So listen, it's a short week. If you play A.J. Brown and he has another, low ceiling game, you're going to feel awful because then you're going into the weekend with a low performance, but this is a good spot. I think A.J. Brown a solid flex option this week, and I think that Devonta Smith on a week-to-week basis is kind of a risky flex who brings upside like we saw in week 5 at 19.4 fantasy points, 10 targets, 8 catches, 114 receiving yards. Like on a week-to-week basis, both of these players still always startable. I know we're getting to a point where some of you guys are really, really frustrated if you own either of them, but if you own them, you can still play them. This is a good matchup. I think you can start them. I know that once again, the Eagles are not throwing the football at a tremendous pace. Jalen Hurts, 280 passing yards this past week was a season high, and that still only resulted in 9.3 fantasy points for A.J. Brown, but at least a pretty good day for Devonta Smith. And essentially the rest of the volume is all going to Dallas Goedert and or Saquon Barkley. But once again, good matchup. Depends on who else is on your roster, I still think both the Eagles wide receivers are startable, just kind of lower end here in week 6 of the season. Then we look to the Giants side of things. Darius Slayton did get a little bit banged up this past week against the Saints, so don't know if he's going to play this week. I know he was a popular waiver ad just due to the Malik Neighbors injury, but really, majority of the volume is going to tight end Theo Johnson and Cam Scatterbo and then Randall Robinson before it's even hitting Darius Slayton. So I don't really feel good about Slayton in general, and I think he's probably going to have a strong chance he doesn't play this week. So that really just leaves Rondell Robinson. I mean, there's other names on this roster, but once again, they're just not getting involved in terms of wide receivers. It's going to the tight end and it's going to the running back. So Robinson is a risky flex this week, but I don't really like this spot. Short week. I mean, the Eagles defense overall is not great against opposing wide receivers, but Quinyon Mitchell is good against opposing wide receiver 1s, and he doesn't really, they don't have anybody else to guard on this Giants team at the wide receiver position. So very risky flex just due to volume alone. But yeah, the next 3 weeks aren't looking great. Maybe the next 4 weeks for the Giants. Eagles, Broncos, Eagles again, then the Niners. So I'm going to say Robinson a very risky flex. I think some of the higher performing ceilings we've seen out of some Giants players like Theo Johnson and Cam Scatterbo could come somewhat back to earth over the next following weeks. And while I still think he could be a risky flex, I'm headed to Underdog to take the under on Rondell Robinson's total receiving yards here in week 6 of the season, currently sitting at 43.5 receiving yards. He has not hit that mark since week 2 of the season. He has a stiff matchup against the Eagles secondary, so I'm headed straight to Underdog to take the under on Robinson's total receiving yards. Don't forget, all new users who sign up on Underdog using promo code THECATCH are getting a free NFL Pick'em to use towards Week 6 NFL action. Take that free Pick'em, take the lower on Robinson's total receiving yards, and if both of those lines hit, you'll automatically double your cash entry And on top of that, Underdog has a new exclusive offer to anyone who signs up using promo code THECATCH. That link is down below. Once you play through $5 on Underdog, you're going to receive $50 in bonus cash to use towards week 6. And on top of that, you're also going to receive a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. So make sure you guys sign up using promo code THECATCH on Underdog if you want to take advantage of all of their week 6 exclusive NFL offers. Early morning Sunday, we're going to have an overseas game in London between the Broncos and the Jets. So let's start with the Broncos side of things. Courtland Sutton is a start every single week, no matter what. This is as safe as a wide receiver 1 as you're going to get. Maybe the ceiling's not always massively high, but you got to feel good. He's at 17.9 or more fantasy points in every game this year, except for that dud in week 2 against the Colts. And I know some people look at this Jets defense and they're not bad, particularly against opposing wide receivers, but they're still not great. And Sauce Gardner's not having like this extreme shutdown year. Like, I don't think he's even on the same level as a player like Pat Surtain, call me crazy, and the rest of the Jets secondary is grading very, very low at the quarterback position. So presumably, I mean, Sauce Gardner's gonna be on Sutton in this game, but that doesn't necessarily scare me. Just look to last week. George Pickens still was able to put together a double-digit performance, only had 2 catches, but had a touchdown and a total of 57 receiving yards off of 2 catches. So, like, maybe it's a lower ceiling this week for Courtland Sutton, but he should still be very solid, still a start for me here in week 6 of the season. In terms of anybody else, I mean, you're always just kind of throwing a dart if you need to start a Troy Franklin or Marvin Mims or whoever on this team. So they're just sits for me. They can always find the end zone, but there's no consistency. So just going to be sits for the rest of the Broncos wide receivers. And then on the flip side here, we have Garrett Wilson going up against Pat Surtain. And this is typically a matchup that I do not like for number 1 corners. And once again here, like, look at the Broncos pass defense. I mean, they have been really good against opposing wide receivers, top 5 against the position. So yeah, I think that this could be a lower ceiling game for Garrett Wilson, similar to Courtland Sutton. But how do you bench a guy like Garrett Wilson? Once again, outside of week 2 here, where he had 9 fantasy points, he's had 19 or more fantasy points in every game this year and a touchdown in every other game other than week 2 on the season. So I still feel good about Garrett Wilson. Might be a lower ceiling game. Don't love him against Pat Surtain. Could depend on who else you guys have on your roster, but for the most part, I believe that Garrett Wilson still belongs in the start category. All right, moving into the early afternoon window, we are going to have the Seahawks traveling to face the Jaguars. JSN coming off of his best fantasy performance of the season, 27.2 fantasy points, 9 targets, 8 catches, 132 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown. As a side note, I'm recording this before Monday Night Football Week 5 has been played, so if there's anything crazy or any injuries that happen to the Jaguars wide receiver room, I'll have a pinned comment down below, but also a little bit difficult to gauge exactly where the Jags defense stands. They haven't been great in terms of fantasy points allowed to wide receivers, bottom 12, technically speaking, at the time I'm recording this, but the secondary has not been bad, nothing to sneeze at, and they cause a lot of turnovers, but I don't really care who JSN is playing. Your wide receiver 4 in full PPR, your wide receiver 5 in half PPR. He's having a monster season. He sees a tremendous amount of volume, so he's just in that must-start category. No questions asked. And Sam Darnold, while he was looking pretty good the previous 3 weeks from a real-life fantasy perspective, he looked absolutely fantastic in that week 5 matchup against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So I think this is still a really good spot for JSN. Anybody else left here? Torrey Horton, I mean, had a nice week this past week. Cooper Kupp, I mean, you're really just kind of throwing a dart here. And I don't want to read too much into this last week because we just got an absolute shootout between the Bucs and the Seahawks. So both Kupp and Horton came out with nice performances, but I have a tough time trusting them in my starting lineup. So you'd have to be desperate. I mean, they're still true desperation flexes, but I think for most of you guys, they're just going to be sits. Then once again, I'm recording this before Monday Night Football, so if anything changes my mind here, or there's any injuries, there'll be a pinned comment down below. But I kind of feel the same way going into Week 6 as I did going into Week 5 about the Jaguars wide receivers. Brian Thomas is a very risky flex. The Seahawks have been pretty good against opposing wide receivers, but it is worth noting that Witherspoon went down for a portion of last week's game against the Bucs, so he could be banged up going into this week. That would be good for Brian Thomas. I just have a tough time with this Jaguars wide receiver room. I mean, really the bulk of this team is playing defense, being able to run the football with Travis Etienne, and that's really it. Like, we're just not getting a fluent passing attack from the Jaguars. So maybe Monday Night Football changes my mind. But if that's not the circumstance, then going into Week 6, B-Tom, risky flex, everybody else, just a sit for me. Next up, we will have the Chargers traveling to face the Dolphins. Let's start with the Chargers side of things, and I have a fear that this is becoming one of the most frustrating wide receiver rooms in all of fantasy football, because at any point in any week, any of these guys could be really solid, or they could be not solid, or they could have a really, really good week or a really bad week. So let's just look at this past week, Week 5 against Washington. 10.8 fantasy points for Keenan Allen. I think it's worth noting that Keenan Allen had the most red zone looks in this game, but then we got some good red zone involvement out of Ladd McConkey, who did finally score a touchdown this past week and get you 14.9 fantasy points. Then Quentin Johnston was kind of the odd man out with the least amount of targets and catches in this game. 4 targets, 4 catches, 40 receiving yards, 6.9 fantasy points, his worst performance on the season yet. And yes, this Dolphins defense is not good, but they actually ranked top 10 against the opposing wide receivers in terms of fantasy points allowed this year. So what exactly do we do here? I mean, they're all startable, and that's just what it's going to be. You can look at these guys as low-end starts. You can look at them as all flex players, whatever you want to look at it, or however you want to look at it. That's all that we can really do here. There's a lot of volume going around here. The Chargers are still throwing the football a lot. This past week was a little bit lower at 29 passing attempts for Herbert, but I also think it's worth noting with the Omarion Hampton injury, maybe we see just more overall volume to the wide receivers. So like I said, I'm kind of fearing this is going to be frustrating, and it's also worth noting that, Joe Alt got hurt. They're already missing Rashawn Slater. That was on display in Week 5. The Commanders' front seven got a lot of pressure on Justin Herbert, and that definitely impacted the game and the Chargers' offense. Now with Hampton going down, I have some concerns about the Chargers offense, but what we can't really deny is that they're going to need to throw to these 3 wide receivers. It's just going to be frustrating from a fantasy perspective. But with that being said, I think they're all solid starts. It's just the ceiling will be capped at times for these 3 guys. Then we look to the Dolphin side of things. If you guys watched Sunday morning's video, I had Jalen Waddle as one of my must-start players of the week after breaking down things a little bit further, evaluating the Dolphins in terms of volume without Tyreek Hill in the past. Jalen Waddle, it is the guy here. 9 targets, 6 catches, 110 receiving yards, a receiving touchdown, 23 fantasy points. If we're just looking at wide receivers, Malik Washington had 5 targets this past week. Nick Westbrook-Ikine had 0 targets. There's really nobody else, if I'm not mistaken, not a single target to another wide receiver on this team. So you would expect Malik Washington to get some sort of involvement going here, but it didn't quite happen this past week with just 4 fantasy points. So him and Nick Westbrook-Ikine remain sits. I mean, Devon Achane, 7 targets, 6 catches. Then Darren Waller, the tight end position, 5 targets, 5 catches. So I think you got to feel good if you own Jalen Waddle is the moral of the story here. It's a tough matchup against the Chargers, but the volume alone will keep him alive. The Dolphins are at home here. Tua looked pretty sharp this past week. So I still think that Jalen Waddle, a very solid start here in Week 6 of the season. Next up, we have the Rams traveling to face the Ravens. This is a smash spot for the Rams wide receivers, and it feels like every single week it's a smash spot for the Rams wide receivers. Outside of week 1, you've gotten double-digit fantasy performances out of both Davante Adams and Puka Nacua every single week. And if you guys own Puka Nacua, it doesn't matter. He's a wide receiver 1 in both half and full PPR. He's on an incredible pace this year so far in every statistical category. You own him, you start him, and this is such a good matchup. The Ravens are the second worst team in terms of fantasy points allowed to wide receivers. You got to fire up Puka Nacua, no questions asked, regardless of matchup, must start wide receiver. And yeah, you got to feel good about Davante Adams this week as well. Maybe his ceiling a little bit lower because that's just what we've seen, but he's still getting plenty of involvement, getting a lot of targets, scoring touchdowns, 3 touchdowns out of 5 games this year. Once again, the matchup's so good. Start both Rams wide receivers with true confidence here in week 6. Zay Flowers, regardless of if we see Lamar Jackson or Cooper Rush at quarterback this week, I still think is a low-end start. Still found a way to get 12 fantasy points in week 5. 5 targets, 5 catches, 72 receiving yards. The Rams secondary has been particularly great against opposing wide receivers, so I like this spot for Zay Flowers. Still startable, lower ceiling if Lamar is out. Still could be boom or bust if Lamar plays. Anybody else here, we just haven't seen any real consistency out of Rashad Bateman, DeAndre Hopkins, whoever else is left over. So every other Ravens wide receiver going to be a sit for me as we move into week 6. Along, we're going to have the Cardinals traveling to face the Colts. Let's start with Marvin Harrison Jr. and the Cardinals. 5 targets, 4 catches, 98 receiving yards, 13.8 fantasy points, and a good matchup against the Tennessee Titans in week 5. Here in week 6 on the road against the Colts, guess what? This Colts defense, they've been pretty good on the year, but they have not been good against opposing wide receivers. This is an even better matchup than it was last week against the Titans, so I really like this spot against the Colts, who are coming in bottom 5 against opposing wide receivers in terms of fantasy points allowed. Got to feel good if you own MH. I know this offense lacks upside. I know Kyler Murray is a little bit banged up, but when we look at volume here, I mean, you get a few targets here and there to Michael Wilson and Greg Dortch, but nothing substantial. Then everything else is going to Trey McBride or their, kind of misfit room of running backs. Get a couple dump offs here and there, but I mean, it is all Marvin Harrison Jr., and they should be getting him the ball even more than they are. This is still a really frustrating offense that kind of baffles me on a week-to-week basis. And tough spot on the road here, but if you own Marvin Harrison Jr., you still got to feel good. Should still be a very solid start here in week 6. Then we look to the Colts. I talked a lot about Michael Pittman last week, like a lot. Really, really liked him going into week 5. 14.9 fantasy points, scored a touchdown, 5 catches, 39 receiving yards. Was honestly expecting a little bit more, but kind of the difficult thing with the Colts offense is like Jonathan Taylor is just having these games like every other week where he's just going absolutely ballistic. And, the Colts play defense. They run the football. Jonathan Taylor scoring 3 touchdowns. They don't need to throw the football a ton. Then some of the potential upside from other players is a little bit lowered because Jonathan Taylor scoring all the touchdowns, but still Michael Pittman has 4 touchdowns in the first 5 games of the year. You got to feel good about him. The Cardinals dealing with some injuries throughout the secondary as they have been all year long. They're still okay against opposing wide receivers, but they also haven't had an incredibly difficult schedule. So still like Pittman here at home. Anybody else here? I think Josh Downs is worth, like a risky flex. But I just have him as a sit because, once again, it's just difficult to trust him. But if you guys are dealing with bye weeks, if you guys have injuries, whatever, Josh Downs, 46% rostered, worth a flex, but you just never know exactly what you're going to get. 11 or more fantasy points in 2 games this year, 6.4 or less in the other 3. So I just have him in the sit category, but could be a potential play if you guys are absolutely desperate. Anybody else on this roster, I have no interest in at the wide receiver position as we move into week 6. Except we have the Cowboys traveling to face the Panthers. Let's start with George Pickens. I'm assuming at the time of recording this, I don't know for sure, but I'm assuming CeeDee Lamb is going to be out in week 6. Obviously, if CeeDee Lamb plays, you're going to start CeeDee Lamb. But let's just go ahead and move forward with assuming that CeeDee Lamb is out, once again dealing with that ankle injury. George Pickens has filled in quite nicely. A little bit of a lower ceiling in week 5. We kind of touched on this during the Broncos-Jets game, but Pickens still at 13.7 fantasy points, 4 targets, 2 catches, 57 receiving yards, and a touchdown. now is a receiving touchdown or more in 4 straight games. You got to feel good if you own Pickens right now. Even if Lamb comes back, I still would feel good about Pickens. I will say the Panthers have been surprisingly very good against opposing wide receivers in terms of fantasy points allowed, but this Cowboys offense are going to throw the football a lot. They're running the football well. They're going to find a way to at least attempt to put up points throughout the course of the game. So if you own Pickens, keep rolling with them. He is a strong start. Not enough here to even mention Jalen Tolbert or Kevontae Turpin as they combined for 1 target this past week. And Kevontae Turpin was out in week 5, but we do need to look at Ryan Flournoy, who had 9 targets, 6 catches, and 114 receiving yards, 18.4 fantasy points against the Jets. I forgot to put his name on the screen, so I'm sorry. Hopefully you guys are listening if you're interested in looking at him. He's 0% rostered, but kind of my issue is if Kevontae Turpin plays in week 5, in week 6, who was out in week 5, I think he just takes over that role. Or we could walk into like a Hunter Renfrow in week 2 type situation where you see a lot of points scored, then you see nothing the following week. So I want to be going out of my way to start Ryan Flournoy this week. I know he had a nice week in week 5, but once again, on the road here, tougher matchup. Kevontae Turpin could take over that volume if he plays this week, and ultimately, it's just not worth the risk here in week 6 of the season at all. Then we move to the Panthers side of things. T-Mac, solid day in week 5 against the Dolphins, 13 fantasy points, 8 targets, 6 catches, 73 receiving yards. Once again, I just worry about the real upside with T-Mac, but this is a great matchup. I mean, the Cowboys are giving up the most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers in the entire league. If you own him, I mean, you got to feel good here, but once again, I just don't know what the true upside is going to be in T-Mac's rookie season with Bryce Young only throwing for over 198 passing yards once all year long. So go ahead and fire up T-Mac, but yeah, I just worry about seeing a true ceiling. We did see more involvement out of Xavier Legette this past week. He had a receiving touchdown. We also saw a little sprinkle of Jimmy Horn, and we still have Hunter Renfrow floating around, but ultimately, I just don't think any of these guys are worth trusting in your starting lineup. Jalen Coker not quite back from IR, but keep an eye on Jalen Coker as well. It's a great matchup, but I just can't feel good about this Panthers passing attack here in week 6. And unfortunately, that's really all I have to say. Next up, we have the Patriots traveling to face the Saints. Stephon Diggs coming off of a big game on Sunday Night Football in a revenge game spot on the road against the Bills. 24.6 fantasy points, 12 targets, 10 catches, 146 receiving yards. He now has 16 or more fantasy points in 2 straight games. He has looked really good overall. This is not a bad matchup, particularly against the Saints. They've kind of risen overall in their ranking against opposing wide receivers. I mean, they do technically come in top 10, but I still don't feel like it's a bad matchup necessarily. The Patriots are on the road here. I still think Stephon Diggs is just a low-end start because, once again, you look back to the first 3 weeks of the season, maybe he wasn't fully healthy, don't get me wrong, but we still saw 11 or less fantasy points in those first 3 games. So I like him this week, don't get me wrong, but I still have him as a kind of a lower-end start because I still don't know exactly what to expect out of the Patriots offense on a week-to-week basis. Anybody else left here, Kayshon Boutte, Demario Douglas, whoever it is, they're all going to be sits for me. But yeah, I mean, feel good if you own Diggs, but I worry we might see just a little bit of a lower ceiling potentially here in week 6 of the season. And then we move to the Saints side of things. Chris Olave on a week-to-week basis, low-end start, will get you 10 to 15 fantasy points, 12.9 fantasy points in week 5, 7 catches off 11 targets, 59 receiving yards. Once again, this offense, the upside is just capped at the end of the day with Spencer Rattler at the quarterback position. But Rashid Shaheed is always a risky flex. 21 fantasy points in week 5 is a good example of why. 114 receiving yards, a receiving touchdown off of 4 catches. But, you know, you look throughout the year, 9.3, 15.2, 8.2, 9.2, 21.4. Those are his fantasy finishes. Very up and down, a lot of risk, but can always be put in the risky flex category. This Patriots defense is starting to look a bit better, but they have still struggled against the wide receiver position. So if you're desperate, Shaheed, somebody you can throw in the flex. Chris Olave, still a solid start, just lower end here in week 6. All right, final game of the early window will be the Browns traveling to face the Steelers. And last week I told you guys I wanted nothing to do with the Browns wide receivers. I am done. across the board. Jerry Jeudy, Cedric Tillman on IR, Isaiah Bond, and anybody else on this team at the wide receiver position, I just want nothing to do with at the end of the day. It's not necessarily a bad matchup. The Steelers have struggled against opposing wide receivers on the year. But once again, what do they really need to defend here? Just Jerry Jeudy, just to put Jalen Ramsey on him? I just want nothing to do with the Browns wide receivers. And I mean, it's worth noting that Dylan Gabriel in his first NFL start wasn't awful by any stretch, even against a decent Vikings defense. He was 19 of 33, 190 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, no turnovers, which is key. But I have a bad feeling this week on the road against the Pittsburgh Steelers. So we'll see how things shake out. But yeah, I mean, he really just threw to the tight ends and got Christian Jenkins involved. So I don't feel good about these Browns wide receivers. Even if you're desperate, I don't feel good at all. Then we move to the Steelers side of things on bye week this past week, but DK Metcalf had a huge week 4 against the Vikings, 23.6 fantasy points in that overseas game, 5 targets, 5 catches, 126 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown. I know without like the big receiving touchdown that he had, we wouldn't be looking at much here, but he has still been a solid start on a week-to-week basis, just pretty much lower end for the most part. And the Browns, I mean, they are a good defense, but they are weak against opposing wide receivers in terms of fantasy points allowed, a bottom 12 unit. So Metcalf is still startable this week, just a little bit lower. And Calvin Austin is questionable going into the week, but he remains, as long as he's healthy, in the risky flex category. But yeah, got a little bit banged up with a shoulder injury in week 4. But he is one of these players, if you're absolutely desperate, he can always stumble into the end zone. But if he doesn't, you're going to be really sad that you started him. So yeah, he's dealing with an injury. Maybe we see more volume to somebody else here, but Roman Wilson has basically done nothing this year, and there's really nobody else to look at in terms of wide receivers on the Steelers roster as we move into week 6. Moving into the afternoon games, we're going to have the Titans traveling to face the Raiders. Let's start with Calvin Ridley, who had his first fantasy performance of the year. Thank God for any Calvin Ridley owners. 18.1 fantasy points, 10 targets, 5 catches, 131 receiving yards. I know a good amount of it came in like the end of the game, but whatever. He got it done finally. Cam Ward and Calvin Ridley, finally a thing. So I had him as a sit like for the past few weeks, but we're bumping him up to the low end start. I don't want to get too carried away here, but you got to look at this matchup. This Raiders defense has been so bad all year long against opposing wide receivers, a bottom 5 unit. So Calvin Ridley, I think due to the matchup and due to what we got this past week, low end start, but I still have concerns with Cam Ward at quarterback and overall for the Titans offense at the end of the day. And Alec Manor remains a risky flex, although he's, kind of not been so great the past 2 weeks, but just due to the matchup alone, could be a guy, if you're absolutely desperate, you could throw in as a flex, but I'm talking like true desperation, and that's only based on the matchup against the Raiders. Then we look to the Raiders side of things. Well, they're getting the Titans defense this week, who is still bottom 10 against opposing wide receivers, still a good matchup, but Jacoby Myers just hasn't done much of anything over the past 3 weeks with 9 or less fantasy points. Geno Smith has looked bad the past 2 weeks with 5 interceptions in 2 straight games. And just 2 passing touchdowns in that stretch. Thought it was 0 for a second, but it's 2. But still, not good. So Myers, Trey Tucker, based on the matchup, risky flexes, and that is it. And I don't even see a high ceiling for them. So, and it's worth noting that this Titans defense is not great against the run either. So I would expect a good amount of Ashton Genty in this game. So we'll see how things shake out. It's a home game for the Raiders, but I can't call Myers or Tucker more than a risky flex here in week 6. Next up, we have the Niners traveling to face the Buccaneers. This should be a good game script and matchup. We'll see how it shakes out. But unfortunately, at the time of recording this early on Monday, I have no idea what's going on with the Niners wide receivers room. We saw Ricky Pearsall and Jawan Jennings both sit out in week 5. We saw a big game out of Kendrick Bourne. Demarcus Robinson is floating around. He had 7 targets in week 5. all that changes depending on if Ricky Pearsall plays, if Jawan Jennings plays, if both of them play, if one of them doesn't play, if Mac Jones is the quarterback, if Brock Purdy's the quarterback, although I'm assuming it's going to be Mac Jones at the end of the day here in week 6 at least. We'll see what happens. I will say I'd like Kendrick Bourne this week. Him and Mac Jones have a good chemistry. Dating back to when they were on the Patriots, and that showed quite a bit in week 5 with 24.2 fantasy points, 142 receiving yards off of 10 catches for Kendrick Bourne. Gets Tampa Bay this week. It's not the best matchup per se, but it could be worse. And ultimately, I'm expecting both these teams to kind of come out here and sling the football around. So Kendrick Bourne on the flex radar. We put him in the waiver wire video, but it does depend on the health of Pearsall and Jennings. And if either of those guys play, they're risky flexes. That's all I can call this wide receiver room at this point in the week. But make sure as the week progresses, you guys are asking questions in the comments down below and throughout the videos, because my thoughts may change here depending on who's healthy and who's not. All right, Emeka Egbuka, we've talked about so much in so many of the videos and the nuclear videos and, early in the season and buy low videos. Like, I have had nothing but good things all year long to say about Emeka Egbuka. He just had his best fantasy performance of the year in week 5, 31.3 fantasy points, 7 targets, 7 catches, 163 receiving yards, and a touchdown. He now has a total of 5 touchdowns on the year, a touchdown in every game but week 3 of the season. Nothing to go over here. This is your wide receiver 3.5 and full PPR. Absolute must-start player. Even against a pretty good Niners defense, you got to keep rolling with him. Now, Mike Evans, don't know at the time of recording this if he's playing in week 6 or not. I think it's likely he misses week 6, but there is a chance he plays. Chris Godwin didn't do a whole lot in a shootout against the Seahawks, just 4 targets, 3 catches. We did see a pretty nice day out of Sterling Shepard, and then we saw some involvement out of rookie Tez Johnson as well, but I don't quite know, while I do like this matchup in the potential game script, I don't quite know that it's going to turn into what we saw last week with Baker Mayfield throwing for 379 passing yards, a season high, and Sam Darnold throwing for a season high 341 passing yards. So I'm not going to dig into all these Bucs wide receivers and talk about them. I'm just going to say that there are risky flexes in Chris Godwin and Mike Evans. If he plays first game back, I would still consider him a risky flex, but the one wide receiver you got to feel good about in terms of the Buccaneers wide receiver room is Emeka Egbuka as we approach week 6. All right, moving into the final game of the afternoon slate, we're going to have the Bengals traveling to face the Packers, and thank the fantasy gods, Jamar Chase is alive, ladies and gentlemen. 29 fantasy points, 10 targets, 6 catches, 110 receiving yards, 2 receiving touchdowns in week 5 against the Lions. I don't care if it was all in garbage time. I don't care how they got it done. Jake Browning, Jamar Chase found a way to get it done, even though Jake Browning and the Bengals offense looked absolutely awful in the first half of the game. So Jamar Chase back in the low-end start category, up from the flex category, but I do worry a lot on the road here for the Bengals here in week 6 against the Packers. I don't think it's going to be as good of a matchup whatsoever. Not that the Lions defense anything to sneeze at, but the Lions don't particularly have a great secondary. The Packers, better secondary, better front 7 also arguably. So I don't love this spot, but I still think Jamar Chase is plenty startable, and you can at least feel somewhat good about this offense compared to recent weeks, I suppose. T. Higgins in the flex category where we had him last week. Can't call him anything more than that, but he did catch a touchdown, 7 targets, 3 catches, 22 receiving yards, 11.2 fantasy points. Once again, can't feel great about Higgins this week, but if you have nothing better, he's still flexible. Then we look to the Packers wide receivers. This is what I had them listed as going into week 4. We knew it was a great matchup. It's a good matchup once again this week against the Bengals, but all these guys are risky flexes. Matthew Golden had 11.3 fantasy points. Romeo Doubs had the big game, 3 receiving touchdowns, 29.8 fantasy points. Then Dontayvion Wicks is still on this roster. I mean, he's arguably a sit here, but it's still a really good matchup this week. So you could see any of these guys pop off. Romeo Doubs would still be my favorite this week due to the red zone chemistry he has with Jordan Love. But Matthew Golden still worth a flex here in week 6. But once again, these Packers wide receivers, they just remain the riskiest flex options that you could possibly have for the most part as we move into week 6. All right, Sunday Night Football, gonna be a good one. We're gonna have the Lions traveling to face the Chiefs. Let's start with the Lions side of things. Amon-Ra St. Brown, regardless of matchup, every single week, must start player. No, he didn't score a touchdown this past week, but he still had 18 fantasy points against the Bengals. And through the first 5 games of the season, he still has 6 receiving touchdowns. Wide receiver 2 in both full and half PPR. No matter what, start Amon-Ra St. Brown. We don't need to break it down extensively. Jameson Williams, just the riskiest flex you could possibly have. And let's face it, I mean, quite frankly, he has not been good from a fantasy perspective this year. 18 fantasy points against one of the worst defenses in week 2. Outside of that, 6.6 or less fantasy points every single game on the year so far. He's still worth a dart throw if you're desperate, but I think for a majority of you guys, you're just going to bench Jameson Williams. What else can we really do until we see something on a week in, week out basis? So very, very risky flex. I know we just talked about the Packers wide receivers. Jameson Williams is probably the riskiest flex you could possibly have in fantasy football. Amon-Ra St. Brown, the only Lions wide receiver that I feel good about. Now, I am recording this before Monday Night Football, as I mentioned throughout the video so far. So if anything crazy happens with the Chiefs wide receivers, I'll have a pinned comment down below. If there's any major injuries, that'll be down below as well. But going into week 6 of the season, I mean, any of these guys, Hollywood Brown, Xavier Worthy, Tyquan Thornton, they're all worth a risky flex start. Then Juju Smith-Schuster also had some involvement in week 4 against the Ravens. So we'll kind of evaluate this after Monday Night Football and see how the volume looks. But yeah, and these guys are starting. I think Xavier Worthy is my favorite start, but he is still dealing with that shoulder injury, so he's expected to be fine. Play against the Jaguars. By the time this video goes out, you guys will know how everything has looked. But I think for that reason, he's still kind of in like the flex area. But he was really, really good in week 4. But that was against the Ravens. Not that the Lions have been great against opposing wide receivers this year, but the Ravens are the worst team in the league against opposing wide receivers in terms of fantasy points allowed. So this will be our last week without Rashee Rice, and then we'll kind of have to reevaluate this wide receiver room anyway. So for me, going into week 6, they are all just risky flexes. All right, Monday Night Football. We're going to have 2 games this week. So let's start with the Bills traveling to face the Falcons. Khalil Shakir just remains a low-end start. Will get you somewhere between 10, 15, 16 fantasy points. Had 11 fantasy points against the Patriots, 9 targets, 6 catches, 45 receiving yards. Gets the Falcons this week. Tough matchup. This secondary hasn't given up a lot of fantasy points to opposing wide receivers, but I think Khalil Shakir still remains in the low-end start category. Not a high ceiling, but you know that he has a safe floor. Keon Coleman was a risky flex last week. Still a risky flex here in week 6. That's all I can call him. Did score a touchdown this past week, had 10 fantasy points, but has been really inconsistent this year and not a great matchup on the road here. The Bills like to, throw the football to quite a few different players and mix it up on a week-to-week basis. So you never know exactly what you're going to get, but Keon Coleman, a risky flex, and that's all we can say. Josh Palmer, just not enough involvement right now to be anything more than a sit. Falcons on bye week this past week in week 5, but Drake London coming off of his best fantasy performance yet in week 4 of the season with 25 fantasy points, 10 targets, 8 catches, 110 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown. This is not a great matchup against the Bills, but you got to feel good about Drake London. Not the greatest start, I think, this week, but still a very solid low-end start. Just don't forget, he had 13 or less fantasy points in the first 3 games of the season. This is not nearly as good of a matchup against the Commanders, but I still think you should feel good here in week 6 against the Bills. Low-end start, but still a good enough start. Anybody else here? Darnell Mooney, who's been banged up. Ray McLeod. I just don't feel good about any of these other Falcons wide receivers going into this coming week. Michael Penix still hasn't done a tremendous amount at the quarterback position, although he did fare much better against Washington in week 4. So Drake London, only Falcons wide receiver I could start. Really the only Bills wide receiver I feel good about here in week 6 is Khalil Shakir. All right, and to wrap things up, we will have the Bears traveling to face the Commanders. Let's start with the Bears side of things, Rome Odunze coming off of a bye week, you got to feel good. Don't forget 15 or more fantasy points in every game on the season for Rome Odunze. Still playing at a very high level, has a touchdown in every game this year, and this is a good matchup. A bottom 10 unit in the Washington Commanders. In terms of fantasy points allowed to opposing wide receivers, this is a clear-cut number one wide receiver for the Bears. He's an absolute must-start wide receiver here in week 6. DJ Moore is still just a risky flex. Don't exactly know what you're going to get here. Has not played at a high ceiling this year at all. Really only has shown up against the Cowboys, who have one of the worst defenses in the NFL. So I don't love him this week, but if you don't have anything better, he's a risky flex. That's all we can really say. Anybody else left over here? Olamide Zacchaeus, Luther Burden, whoever it is, just going to be sits here for me in week 6. But feel good if you own Rome Odunze. All right, and then moving to the Commanders, Deebo Samuel I meant to have as a start. Initially had him as a low-end start because still kind of unsure about the volume if Terry McLaurin returns this week, and that's kind of how I felt this past week. But then further looking at it here for a minute, I mean, Deebo Samuel has had 17 or more fantasy points every game this year except, surprisingly, week 3 against the Raiders. And now he's getting the Bears, one of the worst defenses in the NFL. Good spot here. They've been slightly better against opposing wide receivers, but they're still ranking very, very low at the end of the day. And plus, them being on bye week has kind of shifted some of the overall rankings with some poor performances from other teams in week 5. So I still really like Deebo Samuel at home here in week 6. If Terry McLaurin plays, I still like Deebo Samuel. He's just got to be a start. But I think there's a strong chance Terry McLaurin is out once again in week 6. If he does play, risky flex due to the matchup alone. Outside of that, I can't call him anything more than that. And if he sits, Deebo Samuel is an absolute must-start player this week. Now, I have Luke McCaffrey as a sit, but once again, based on the matchup, if Terry McLaurin misses week 6, Luke McCaffrey could be a risky flex at best. But still, in terms of the Commanders' pass catchers, we're just not seeing any consistency really step up to the plate in the absence of Terry McLaurin. Guys like JCM at running back, Zach Ertz at the tight end position, and Deebo Samuel are really the only players benefiting. And even that, Zach Ertz hasn't been very good the past 3 weeks or so. But nonetheless, Deebo, strong start, good matchup. And Terry McLaurin, implications here could be felt for guys like Luke McCaffrey and even Deebo Samuel. We will see how things shake out here in week 6. And there you guys have it. Every single matchup, every single player at wide receiver, and who you should be starting or sitting here in week 6 of the fantasy season. Don't forget, guys, I'm answering as many fantasy football questions as I can in the comment section down below. So if you guys need anything whatsoever, be sure to drop me a comment. I'll answer as many as I can throughout the week. And while you guys are down there, it does me a huge favor, helps out the channel tremendously if you guys hit that subscribe button and that like button on the way out. And when the videos, playlists pop up on the screen as the week progresses, we're going to have everything you could possibly need to dominate week 6 of the fantasy season. So make sure you guys are checking out all of the content on the channel this week. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.